right, you guys. So today we're talking about religion in medieval times. And our essential question to focus on is how did the religion of Christianity specifically rule the average person's life in the Middle Ages? And so just to kind of remind you that religion was such a central focus of life during the medieval times. I mean, really, if you were in Western Europe, if you were in Eastern Europe, you had a religion that you followed, and that dominant religion was Christianity. Now, whether it was the Roman Catholic Church or the Greek Orthodox Church that we see in the Byzantine Empire, it is not necessarily something that we're going to look at today, but what we do need to remember is that religion in this time period, every single person is exposed to it. Every single person's life is touched by the church during this time, and what you believe will dictate if you live or die. And so we're going to be looking at how Christianity kind of grew to be the power that it was and how it affected the average person's life in the Middle Ages. Now, just a reminder, you guys, you are supposed to type down the underlined portions of all my notes. You do not have to type everything. You are just typing the underlined portions into the focus notes template provided, and that this is an assignment. So first, I would like to talk about the role of the church. So as I stated previously, the church was basically the center of medieval life in Western Europe. Again, it is something that they focus on. Every single person in the Middle Ages in Western Europe is going to have some kind of church service that they go to, not necessarily because it's like, oh, well, we have to go here, or, oh, I should go to church. It was literally, this is what I do at this time. There was no questioning of why you did it or when you did it. Every village and town had a church a church building. As you saw on the map of the manor that we did in the feudalism packet, there was a church in the center of that manor, right? So churches were everywhere, whether it be a small church because it was a small area, or a larger church, much fancier, due to it being in a wealthier section of the land or whatever it was. Every village and town does have a church. And that's primarily because the church was responsible for providing education and help for the poor and the sick. So the church is where you kind of see schools develop. They are caring for the poor and the elderly and the sick, and they are providing clothing for those who can't provide it for themselves. They are giving out food. They are taking in people in need. And so the church was this center of community. And honestly, your village or your manor could not survive if the church was not doing their job properly. So when the church kind of starts to get a little behind in its services in some areas later in the Middle Ages, we'll talk about that in a little bit here, we see problems start to develop in the average person's life, and it's simply because the church was not doing the job that they had promised to do. So keep in mind that the church is that center of education. It is that center for help. And really, at the end of the day, you guys, the church is supposed to explain all world events. If there's an earthquake, well, this is why it's happening. If there's no rain in the season and all of our crops are dying and people are starving, well, the church is supposed to explain it. The church is just supposed to interpret God's meaning for everyone's life at this time. And basically, whatever happens in your day-to-day life has to be able to be explained by the church, because that's the only answer that you really have. And because of this, because people turn to the church for every single answer that they need, people end up believing that all parts of everyday life related to Christianity. And so you see, people giving thanks for being able to wake up in the morning. You see people knowing that the food that they eat, that the job that they have, that the responsibilities that they bear as part of a medieval society are going to be part of their religion. They're going to give thanks. They're going to pray for help when they need it. And every single day is given over to whatever happened can be explained by God's purpose for my life, or however they kind of interpreted it. So just understand that the church is the center of life. The church is responsible for our community's survival, and they are supposed to explain everything that happens to us because we have nowhere else to turn. So let's take a moment here and kind of review / redefine what Christianity actually is. Christianity is a religion that is based on the life and teachings of a man named Jesus Christ. Now, we have already kind of discussed this in a variety of ways throughout this year, but just kind of understand that Christianity, in the sense of historical use, which is how we're going to be looking at it today, we are looking at a religion that is based on the life and teachings of a single man, and his ideas were rooted in Judaism. and then they grew into their own separate religion, and that is done under the Roman Empire. So I want to kind of review again just the growth of the Christian church. Remember that the beginnings of Christianity really are rooted in ancient Rome. The Jews were not treated too well under the Roman Empire. And so through them, they have this idea of a prophet coming, a son of God. He will come and he will tell us a new way to live and a new way to interpret our religion. And through that, we will become better and safer people because he will bring us a new kingdom. And so that's basically what happens, right? So Jesus comes along, he spreads that message. It's not a new idea. They've been waiting for it. So he gains a massive following. Now, Christians are the followers of Christianity or the followers of Jesus Christ. And remember that Jesus was killed by the Romans, not the Jews. He was killed by the Romans around the first century CE, according to whatever written records we have been able to find. And the Christians who followed his teachings are actually going to suffer a similar persecution. So basically, what we see is at the start of Christianity, Romans are persecuting Christians, or they're targeting Christians, they're killing Christians because they believe a religion that is different from the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire really relied on the fact that, our Roman gods are going to keep us safe, and therefore we need to make sure that everyone is sacrificing the right way, that everyone is believing the right thing. And so Christianity was this threat to not only keeping the peace of, hey, we're Rome and we're all going to believe this religion and kind of do our thing, but they're also a threat to the safety of Rome. By not believing in the Roman gods, they threaten the very foundation that Rome was built on. So Rome ends up persecuting Christians for their beliefs up until about 313, when Emperor Constantine realizes that Christianity is just not going to go anywhere, and so he makes Christianity the legal religion of Rome. Now, there's a bunch of legends about Constantine having visions on the night of a battlefield and almost dying, etc., but basically what we need to understand is Constantine looks at this and says, politically, Christianity is not going anywhere. So in 313, he makes Christianity that legal religion in Rome. It then only continues to gain its popularity, and now it has all of Rome behind it in order to kind of stick around for the rest of history. So, continuing on with the growth of the Christian church, we now get to the start of the Middle Ages. Remember, the Middle Ages begin when Rome falls. And so, keep in mind that just before Rome falling apart, all Christians did belong to the Roman Catholic Church. There's no schism yet. There's no breaking it in half. All Christians belonged to the Roman Catholic Church located, guess where? In Rome. So, everyone is following Rome's lead. But then Rome collapses. The empire is gone, but the church remained. And so what happens is during this time period where Rome is suddenly gone, the law of the land is gone. We have no emperor. We have no organization in regards to government. The church is our only link to stability. And so people are going to turn to the church so much more because they give leadership in a time of crisis, in a time of chaos. So when the empire falls apart, the church remains, and the Roman Catholic Church only gains in popularity because everybody's looking to them as, what do we do next? The church is what's going to give us that sense of leadership, that sense of stability and safety. In particular, we have monasteries. And as we know from our Unit 2 vocabulary, monasteries are these communities of monks where these people of the church were giving people who are not of the church, but just your average followers, they were giving them homes and food, shelter, safety, you guys. People are not able to turn to their government anymore because there is no government. There is just chaos everywhere. And so the church is going to be giving them the answers that they need. Like, where do I sleep tonight? What do I feed my children? And the church is giving that through the monasteries or the communities of monks. Eventually, the monks are going to become responsible for copying and preserving old texts. So again, that language of writing and that the ability to keep track of history and to keep track of records is going to kind of fall into the church because, again, there is no organization system to take over that. There is no government official. There is no one in charge saying, hey, you are now a scholar. You are now a warrior. Society is rebuilding itself because the empire has collapsed, and the church is going to basically guarantee the survival of history, not only by providing people with shelter and food when they need it, but for also preserving ancient knowledge. Now, the church was organized by, again, we have a triangle here. Basically, remember that at the top of the triangle, we have the most power, and at the bottom of the triangle, we have the least amount of power. And basically what we want to do is we want to talk about who was organized, who was in charge of what, and how the organization kind of came into play. So, as we know, the Roman Catholic Church is led by the Pope. The Pope is the supreme head of the church. He is God's representative here on earth. And what the Pope says is what God is saying. So, we do not argue with him, basically. At the end of the day, the Pope is the head of the church, meaning that if he says, this is what you believe, that is what you believe. You do not argue, you do not question. The Pope is the absolute authority here on earth for anything related to Christianity, especially at this time. His second in command are the cardinals. The cardinals assist the Pope and advise him on maybe some theological questions like, what kind of bread do we use for communion? Do we use leavened bread? Do we use unleavened bread? So if that's the question the Pope is being asked, what he'll do is he'll say, okay, cardinals, I want you to go find, what do people think? What do we have on record? What does the Bible say? What verses can you tell me that will help me make my decision? And so the Pope kind of has the cardinals there assisting him, advising him. They're kind of like a sounding board where he's like, okay, this is what I'm thinking. And then the Pope makes the final decision, again, based off of what the cardinals have provided him with. Beneath the cardinals, we have the archbishops. The archbishops oversaw large or important areas of land. They are in charge of this area is mine to make sure that the church's laws and the church's ideas are being followed. And so what you're looking at is the archbishops are going to actually be located outside of the church building, but they are in charge of those areas. And then they report back to the cardinals, who then report back to the Pope of here's how London is doing. Here's how New England is doing, or whatever it is, right? So they're looking at these larger important areas of land for how the people of that area are handling whatever religious laws are in place. Then we have the bishops. The bishops govern smaller areas away from the center of Rome, and they are ruling from cathedrals. And so a bishop would be in charge of, say, a city. So there's a bishop of San Francisco. He reports back to the Archbishop of California. Then the Archbishop reports back to the Cardinal, who's, in charge of everything. And then the Cardinal reports back to the Pope, who is the supreme head of the church. Again, it's a system of organization. It is a system where people are in charge of these very specific areas of governance, and then they report back to somebody else. And again, it all feeds back into the Pope. Lastly, on this ladder, we have the priests. The priests are the people you're going to find inside every single church building. They govern small parishes. So the priests are the ones who are on the manors, right? There's a priest in charge of that village, in charge of that manor. They report back to the bishops who govern the larger area of land around the manor. Maybe they, govern the fief. Then the bishop reports back to the archbishop, who oversees the entire kingdom. The archbishop reports back to the cardinal, who assists the Pope and advises him on what's going on and what the people really need from him. And then the Pope is the supreme head who makes the final decision. Again, this is the organization of the Catholic Church, right? We have the Pope, the cardinals, the archbishops, the bishops, and the priests. For your tests, for your quizzes, and for your own sake through the rest of this unit, you do need to memorize the order of who was in charge of who, as well as who was in charge of what. So, who's in charge of the larger important areas of land, who's in charge of the smaller areas of land, who's in charge of the small parish in their own church building, right? You will be quizzed on this consistently throughout the rest of this unit. So please make sure that you do have this page written down. Now, the triangle here has Catholics at the bottom. That is simply because what you're looking at is the Catholics are the believers of the Catholic Church, right? So the Catholics go to church. They're your average person. They see the priests who provide them that church service, and then we know how the priests report and on up through the social ladder of the Catholic Church. Now, we really need to look at the power of the church. The medieval church was actually given land through the monarchs, the wealthy lords. So our kings or our nobles are going to be providing the church with the land that they need in order to build their churches and their buildings. And then through that land, they're able to kind of get some more money because of the, if you own land, obviously you can earn money from it. Sometimes though, especially in the early days, the church actually took land by force. They would come in and, they were kind of like a warrior force at the very, very start of that Roman Catholic Church. I mean, the Pope used to be a warrior and he'd ride into battle. Eventually that idea goes to the wayside because they realize, you can't really have a Pope who goes out and kills people and then prays on Sundays. And so they start separating that a little bit more. But in the early days, especially when the church did not have what it needed, it did take land by force. Eventually, the church became much more of a political entity and would actually take land through political force rather than actual warfare. The church made its money through tithes or taxes on the people. So, biblically speaking, some people have actually interpreted parts of the Bible to say that you owe 10% of what you make in a year to the church. And the Roman Catholic Church really utilized that. So, let's say, for example, I make $100 in a year. 10% of that is $10. I automatically have to give $10 to the church. And so they actually taxed people just for belonging to the church, and for the fact, the simple fact of the matter is everyone belonged to the church, right? Peasants, knights, nobles, kings, queens, everyone belonged to the church. And so everyone had to pay taxes or tithes to the church, no matter who or where you were. Latin was the only universal language throughout Europe. Remember that Latin was the universal language of Rome as the empire, and basically that sticks around. Even though Rome is gone, everyone still reads and writes in Latin. They're able to speak Latin, and so the church actually capitalizes on this. And so the church eventually becomes really the only ones who can actually read and write in society. Therefore, they have a lot of power because they're working for kings and queens who might not actually be educated, especially in the early days. And so Latin is that universal language. The church relies on Latin as a unifying force, because if I'm in the church in England and I have to go travel to the church in the Eastern Europe or the Middle East or even the northern tip of Africa, I'm guaranteed to be able to communicate with my fellow church members because they speak in Latin. Now, eventually what's going to happen is the average church person, the average church Catholic, the person going to church who's a peasant, they can't understand Latin. Eventually, they're not going to be able to know it, but the church service is still in Latin. And so that will become a problem of its own. But just understand that especially in the early days of the church officials were the only ones who could actually read and write, and so therefore they have a lot of power. If a king needs a letter written, he's going to go to the church official at his court and be like, "Hey, I need you to write a letter for me," and the church official is going to do that. They're going to write for the kings and queens, so they have inside knowledge to the inner workings of kings and queens throughout Europe. They know who is talking to who and what deals are being made simply because they're the ones writing the letters. Eventually, kings and queens will become educated in their own right, but especially during the early days, like Charlemagne, for example, the church officials are the only ones who can actually read and write. Now, just to kind of put this in perspective, you guys, this is the Vatican. This is the center of the Roman Catholic Church. This is obviously an artistic rendition from a long time ago. And then this is the Vatican today. It has not changed too much, but you can see that the amount of people who go there are still very, very numerous. And the popularity of the church has only increased throughout history. And so you'll see basically the church today makes a lot of money. They have a lot of power, and it's worldwide still. Obviously, when you have the question of power, we're going to have conflict between the church and our kings and queens, our monarchs, right? So here's the thing, you guys. If you think about the feudalism triangle, we have the kings and queens at the top, we have the monarchs. Then we have the nobles. Then we have our knights. And at the bottom, we have our peasants and serfs. The question is, where is the church on the feudalism triangle? And the answer is they're not there. They are not on the feudalism triangle. So the question is, where do they go? They have a lot of power, they have a lot of money, but they're not on the triangle. So where do they belong? Well, if you ask the church, hey, where do you belong on the feudalism triangle? The church really felt, hey, we're at the top of the triangle. We're above the monarch. We are above the king and queen because we are God's representatives on earth. It is our job to tell you what God is saying, what God wants for the, people of the Middle Ages to do. Therefore, you're going to have to listen to us over your king and queen because we are the ones who say who goes to heaven and who doesn't. But if you go back to the kings and queens of England or the kings and queens of France or Spain or any other country in Europe, those kings and queens are going to be like, actually, we're on top of the triangle. Kings felt that we are the top of the power because basically kings were like, we were chosen by God to rule. The divine right of kings tells us that God chose us to rule over you as your king. Therefore, the church should listen to me. This is going to become the absolute epitome of the Middle Ages. This is the fight, you guys. It's the church versus the king versus the church. Who is in charge? No one knows. Because the church is like, hey, God chose us to represent him, therefore we tell kings what to do. Kings, you then get in line with us. Kings are saying, well, actually, we were chosen by God to rule over people. That's how we're justifying our absolute power here. So technically, we are in charge of the church. Church, you get to listen to us, right? And so we're going to have this back and forth throughout history. It's going to be an absolute mess. So basically, what you're going to see is the church and the kings arguing against each other constantly. And the church is going to utilize its biggest weapon, excommunication. Remember that excommunication is the process of being thrown out of the church, right? Meaning that you and anyone you rule over, aka king who rules over England, for example, if you get excommunicated, you cannot guarantee that your people are going to be able to go to heaven after they die because the church has kicked you out. And so this is the most powerful weapon that the church has. They don't want to overuse it, right? Because then it doesn't mean anything. But if you're a king and you're getting dangerously close to the church saying, that's it, you are excommunicated. If the church tells me as a king that I am excommunicated, it means my people are not going to be too happy with me because the people are going to see, oh my gosh, my life is miserable. I'm a peasant. I live in an absolute tiny little hut. The Black Death is coming around. Everyone's dying. I just want to guarantee that life after death is better than what I'm living through right now. And now you're telling me that because my king tried to get more power than he should, that we're not able to go to heaven? Well, guys, if your people are not happy, you're not going to stay king for long. And so if you're a king, it's a fine balance. You need to make sure, yes, I am all powerful. No one can argue with me. But I also need to make sure the church is my friend because I need to guarantee my people the chance that life after death is better than whatever life I'm able to give them here on earth. And so, again, the church and the kings, the monarchs are going to be fighting it out over who has the absolute power because both of them really feel that they really should be the top of that feudalism triangle and should have the final say for anybody who has, this question of who do I turn to for an answer. The most famous example that I like to talk about, the church versus the king is Thomas Becket and Henry II. So I just want to preface this by saying that Henry II is like my, oh gosh, you guys, I want to say second favorite person in history to study. This guy was insane and amazing. Not necessarily in a good way. You should definitely check him out. But I'm going to give you a short history version of it real quick. So Henry II became King of England after fighting for most of his life for that throne. His mother was supposed to inherit the throne of England when her father died because she was the only living child of this king. Well, she was a girl, and so everyone looks at her and goes, you can't rule England, you're a girl, and so they kick her out. And she basically spends her life fighting for her ability to take back her throne from her cousin who's like, hey, I'm a guy, I'll take over England for you. So she fights. She has a son. She tells her son, you should be the king of England. They end up fighting for most of his adult life, and he ends up winning. He's like, look, I'm now the new king of England. It is my birthright, etc. So he comes to England, where England is an absolute mess. There are no laws. Everyone's doing what they want. No one really knows who's in control. And so Henry II comes in and is like, I can make this better. And so he wants to bring the church under his control in order to make sure that England is organized. And that's really what it comes down to. Henry as a king was incredibly brilliant, very smart, but he threw the temper tantrums of a 3-year-old. Like there are reports of him throwing himself onto the floor and biting things and like kicking and screaming and punching. And it's simply because he didn't get his way on, whatever it was. And so we have this man with extreme anger issues, and he has kind of brought England under his control. And the last thing he wants to do is make sure that the church can't tell him what to do, but that in fact he can tell the church what he wants them to do instead. So what he does is he waits for the Archbishop of Canterbury to die, because that means I, as the king, Henry II, I can now appoint my buddy, Thomas Becket, to the Archbishop of Canterbury. And so here's the thing. His friend Thomas Becket didn't really want to be part of the church. Instead, what happens is we see Thomas Becket being like, dude, I've never been part of the church. I don't want to be part of the church. I like to have my, fine clothing and lots of money. I don't really want to have to become part of the society that says I have to give all that away. And so he's like, are you sure I have to do this? And Henry is like, come on, man. I rule England. You become the Archbishop of Canterbury. You can have a lot of power of church in England. The two of us together will bring the church under the control of the king and make it so that the king is officially the top of the feudalism triangle. And I now, as king, can control the church in my country. And so Thomas Becket is like, all right, fine, I'll do it because I don't have a choice. You're my king, but I really don't want to do this. And so Henry is thinking, cool, I officially got Thomas Becket, my best friend, my buddy. He owes me everything. He is now in charge of the church. That means I'm in charge of him, and I'm now in charge of the church. So Henry basically gets Thomas Becket in. He's the Archbishop of Canterbury. And then Henry goes to the government and he's like, okay, I want to make a law that says any clergy member, any member of the church who commits a crime is responsible for paying for that crime under England's laws and not the church's. So let me just kind of give you the worst case scenario here. Let's say some guy wanders around and kills 5 people. He should be charged with murder. If he runs and joins the church and becomes a priest in the church and then is caught for the murders, the king cannot try him. The king has no legal right to actually put that man under a system of government where he's going to be punished for his crimes. Instead, the church says, oh, this guy committed murders, but it's okay. He's part of the church now. So if he says 5 Hail Marys, we're good to go. Henry looks at this and says, no, that is not right. I want to have control over the law in my land, and that means any church member who breaks the law in my land is responsible to me, not the church. And so he's like, all right, I'm making this law. The Pope's not going to like it, but I got my best friend Thomas Becket, the Archbishop of Canterbury, on my side. And so he's like, hey, Thomas, I'm passing this law. Make sure you get the church on board. Thomas says no. Becket's like, sorry, you can't do that. You guys, to say that Henry II flips out is the understatement of any historical sentence I could say. Henry II loses it. He has promoted his best friend to be in charge of the church specifically to make sure he can pass this law. He makes the law, it's about to be passed, and Becket says, no, the church has more power over you. You're just a mortal man. You're just a king. I, as part of the church, am better than you because the church has the final say. Henry II loses it. He's like, what are you talking about? What's going on? You owe me. And Becket's like, I'm sorry. I'm part of the church. I owe you nothing. And so there's this famous thing in history where Henry II basically throws a temper tantrum during Christmas time. And he has a little too much to drink, according to reports, and he screams out into the hall, who will rid me of this troublesome or turbulent priest? And there's some knights who overhear him say, like, who will get rid of this guy for me? And so they go and ride out to where Thomas Becket is having a church service on Christmas Eve, and they completely and brutally murder Thomas Becket during his Christmas sermon. Henry II is blamed for Thomas Becket's murder and eventually has to make a lot of effort to get back into the church's good graces. And basically it goes down in history as one of the most brutal murders of all time because of the situation at hand, right? So I just need you to understand that Henry II, all he wanted to do was bring the church under his control. He tries this political maneuver of getting his friend Thomas Becket into this Archbishop of Canterbury seat. He tries to pass a law and his best friend says no. And we see here the epitome of the church versus the monarch, right? Becket, as the church, is saying, we are separate. We have more power than you ever will because we are the church and you have to do what we say. Becket even excommunicates Henry, and that really brings things even worse to a head before his death because Henry's like, I can't be excommunicated. The people of England want to be part of the church. And so, again, we see this example of the control, the fight for the control between the church and the monarch between Henry II and Thomas Becket, the Archbishop of Canterbury. That was a lot of information, and I know I got super excited there and talked quickly. As always, you can pause, you can write down the underlined stuff as you go. Hopefully you enjoyed how excited I was about this sermon. I promise you there's going to be more lectures coming in your future where I get all nerdy and really enjoy myself. For right now, though, we're going to pause in our examination of religion in medieval Europe. Please answer the essential question in your summary in 2 to 3 complete sentences, and tell me, based on these notes, how did the religion of Christianity rule the average person's life in the Middle Ages? Thank you, guys. I look forward to reading your answers.